Begin today with a showdown in Washington, and it's not on Capitol Hill. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court will hear arguments that could reshape the very limits of presidential power and decide the future of President Trump's entire trade agenda. At issue, whether the president has the authority via the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, you're going to hear a lot of that, to impose sweeping tariffs that have brought in more than $215 billion in revenue this fiscal year alone. Critics call it executive overreach. Supporters call it smart leverage against China and a nation or nations that have done us wrong on trade, also a lifeline for American industry.
I'm quite optimistic, and Shannon, what I can tell you is that because of what the Chinese did on October 8th, threatening to put export controls on any rare earth products that they produce that had 0.01% of rare earths produced in China, that they were going to try to control those, and the president was able to push back using his IEPA powers. If that's not use of an emergency power, at an emergency time, I don't know what is.
And in typical Trump fashion, the president may even show up to the high court himself. I certainly hope he does. David, I'm going to come to you first on this and take it wherever you would like, whether you want to talk about, we've got two attorneys on the panel, so
I'm outnumbered.
If you want, but also this is, if you read some of the comments from the filings from the small businesses, this has been a great hardship to smaller businesses.
Absolutely, it has, and of course the legal issues are, I'm vaguely familiar with them, so correct me if I've made any mistakes here to our lawyers, but a lot of the case does center around the question of a tax, whether a tariff is a tax that needs to be approved by Congress, as the Constitution says. Again, the lawyers are going to discuss that. The Supreme Court is going to hear arguments on all sides of that. But here's one thing that could hurt the folks who claim that it is just a tax. It is, I would say it is a tax, but it is a lot of other things as well. And what happens if you return the revenue, the enormous amount of money, those $300 billion plus that are coming in annually because of the tariffs, if you return that directly to the taxpayers, does it remain a tax? Now, our lawyers can talk about that. I put it to other lawyers, some of whom have argued in front of the Supreme Court, who say that would be a problem or something that the Supreme Court would take into effect in terms of deciding that question. If it is a tax that's given right back to the taxpayers, of which there are about 158 million in the United States, divided up, that rounds up to about $1,200, $1,300 a year for those individual taxpayers. That might change the situation. Of course, it does have costs. It has costs certainly to certain companies, certainly to certain countries that have had to pay into it. But if it is decided by the Supremes that it has to be paid back, how exactly do you go about doing that? I mean, it is an enormously complex problem. So those are the issues I'm looking at.
All right, can I jump in on that
one?
Yeah.
Part of it is it a tax for small businesses, for consumers? Is that, constitutionally allowed? Or to frame it another way, and if I were arguing this, I would go to, did Donald Trump and the administration have the right, through IEPA, to declare a national emergency because of a $1.2 trillion trade deficit? And I would kind of start there before I got to whether the implications were that it was a tax or not, even though both issues are related. And also related, not just to the deficit aspect, is the fentanyl aspect of this, too, because the president has said fentanyl coming over our borders is a huge issue, most of it coming from China, coming up through the southern border, and of course it's coming across through Canada as well. Regarding IEPA, which is the powers that he used, the emergency powers that he used to do this, traditionally this has not been used in this way before, and that's what the other side is going to argue. They're going to say, traditionally we've seen this for targeted economic sanctions, for freezing assets of bad actors, or import restrictions where necessary, not to impose, David, what you're calling this potential tax to corporations and American consumers. So once you sort of channel down through there, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do. They're much smarter than I am. But those are some of the issues that they'll be looking at.
Point, but go ahead.
Here's where I go. I jump ahead to what Scott Bessent said, which is if the court rules against Trump, if they rule for him, he's fine. We carry on as usual. If they rule against him, Scott Bessent has talked about at least 4 different ways the administration can go about doing this in a different way. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows for 15% broad-based tariffs for 150 days to calm trade imbalances. That would be a blanket way with less paperwork, as we've talked about with some of the national security stuff. He also talked about Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. It allows up to 50% on countries that discriminate against U.S. commerce. So that makes sense. We've talked about 232 in the past, national security, and 301 as well, which is unfair trade practices. They've got a lot of different ways they can go about this. Will it be confusing? Will it be murky? Will it make the whole process take longer? Absolutely. But I think this is fascinating just to watch it play out.
Yeah, I sort of come at this from 2 different angles. And I want to end on a market's view. Thomas, I'm curious if you agree or disagree with me on this. The first view is that if you think about a lot of people who went to the polls for Trump was really limit government. I think a lot of people felt that the previous administration had just expanded powers, and people really wanted to pull that back, whether it was spending or the power of the government. So in some cases, it may not go that way. If we think about an editorial I read on Neil Gorsuch, who, if you think about an originalist, separation of powers, does not think that this power resides within the presidential power, that maybe it does reside within Congress, and we're going to have to debate and see how that argument comes back. But I tend to usually always be in favor of pulling back power. I want less government in my life. That being said, and from a market's perspective, and the markets have done great. We're on a 6-7 month straight gain. Markets, to me, want certainty. Yep. No matter the outcome, I think we want clarity on this issue. This has been the biggest issue for the markets in trying to determine a path forward. Can we go higher in the market? I think we need certainty in either direction. So I think actually, regardless of how it turns out in the short term, markets can breathe a sigh of relief, as they have been. They've been breathing through this whole thing, and at least getting big clarity on this big issue.
Yeah, I agree with you, Taylor. The big thing, though, this is all about the bond market. If we had to hypothetically return $215 billion of revenue, you're going to see yields spike. Part of this is, we ran a surplus, $31 billion collected. We ran a $256 billion surplus in April. That was related to tax also, in addition to the tariffs. September, we ran a surplus. So it's showing fiscal responsibility. And we as taxpayers, inflation has been modest. We're getting defense. We're getting infrastructure. We're getting education. We're getting all these things without additional taxes. So, and that's evidenced by the fact that inflation has been subdued. If this was explicitly a tax on the taxpayer, inflation would probably be running 4%, 5%, et cetera. Plus the compression of the bond yields, because we're getting this additional revenue showing responsibility, has brought down financing costs. And we're on the cusp, potentially before the end of the year, of a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage below 6%. I think we're at 6.15 today. And a lot of this is a function of record revenue starting to pour into the Treasury, both from growth for deregulatory growth policies and from tariff income.
We still paid $1.2 trillion on interest on the national debt for the fiscal year. So it hit an all-time high. Yeah. The average was 101 point almost 3 billion a month.
Yep.
So we brought in enough tariff revenue in a fiscal year to cover roughly 2 months of interest on the national debt. However, to your credit, what you're talking about is that there has been a tightening of the deficit year over year, and there was a Bloomberg article that U.S. Treasuries have actually caught a bid from July to October and caught up with the rest of the developed world. That U.S. Treasuries have outperformed the G7 ex-U.S. The debt of the G7, excluding the United States, fell 3.8%, almost 4% from July to October. U.S. Treasuries, the total return was up 2.2%. Yeah. So the bond market is telling you that, in my view, that this revenue is not going away.
That's right.
Based on how they've performed, how treasuries have performed. And it's also the belt tightening of reducing the size of federal government.
Not to mention the revenue's been allocated 6 ways to Sunday to all kinds of different things they've discussed doing with it. And so to David's point, to return that then to taxpayers, I mean, you have to claw it back, take it from somewhere because it's been spent over here, and figure out what a distribution would be. That would be a mess.
And by the way, there is, if in fact all of what we've been told about the investments coming into the U.S. and U.S. companies themselves, like Apple, investing another $500 billion, when the jobs are created for what they are now creating, you will have a tremendous increase in payroll taxes as well. That has happened historically with Reagan, with Trump in the first term, et cetera.
I didn't finish my thought, but the bond market is not, or bond investors, treasury investors are not behaving as if the Supreme Court will take away
That's right.
this revenue.
Right.
I've been out and I don't know how to speak because
You're
I haven't
good.
really, I haven't made complete sentences in about 10 days.